Welcome to part 2 of my brakes and bearings adventure. In my last video, I showed you what can happen if you wait too long to service your bearings. In this video, I'm going to walk you through how to repack your bearings and how to refresh your brake system. My truck has manual locking hubs. After pulling the wheels off, the manual hub should slide right off. Just like the driver's side, this outer lock nut wasn't even finger tight. It was completely loose. This is super sketchy because it's supposed to be torqued down to 150 foot-pounds. I'm pretty sure this is what caused the driver's side bearing to fail. Before you can pull the lock nut off, use a screwdriver to gently pop off the C-clip. And then you can remove the axle thrust washers along with the outer lock nut, the lock washer, and then you can remove the adjusting nut. Next, unbolt the caliper from the knuckle and tie it off to the frame of the truck with a zip tie to keep pressure off the brake line. Carefully pull the rotor off the spindle. The outer bearing is loose and will fall off when you pull the rotor off. This part is optional. You can leave yours on, but I just prefer the look of not having a dust shield. Wipe off the spindle and inspect for wear. This side was still in good shape. To remove the wheel seal and inner bearing, I prop the rotor onto an old wheel spacer and tap the bearing out with a wooden dowel and hammer. There she is. Yum. I have a bunch of spare bearings I pulled at the local pull and save, as well as a complete set of new bearings, but I have never reused bearings before, so I decided to try cleaning these ones out and giving them a go. Using gasoline, I soaked all the axle hardware and bearings before wiping them down with a rag. Once you get everything all clean, it's time to get messy again. I use Lucas Oil Extra Heavy Duty Grease to pack the bearings. The rotors I got from AutoZone already had the new races pressed in, so once I had the bearings well packed, I dropped the inner bearing into the back of the rotor and installed a new wheel bearing seal with a rubber mallet. Before mounting the rotor to the spindle, I applied some grease to the spindle and then pushed the new rotor over top. I then packed the outer bearing and slid it over the spindle till it was seated inside the rotor. Next, install the inner lock nut or the adjusting nut and tighten it down to about 35 foot-pounds and turn the rotor to make sure the bearings are seated correctly. Then back off the inner lock nut. Next, slide the lock washer over the pin, install the outer lock nut and tighten to 150 foot-pounds. Here, I'm using a one-piece thrust washer off an older Ranger and then securing everything down with a C-clip. Here's a closer look at how all the hardware goes back together. You can tell the difference between the inner lock nut, or also called the adjusting nut, from the outer lock nut because the inner lock nut is a little bit thicker. And it also has this dimple right here, which is supposed to match with the lock washer. Here's my old trash spindle. I'm going to show you how it all goes together. Inner lock nut screws on. Here you can see the lock washer has a little protuberance or whatever you want to call it there. And the lock washer only goes on one way. You can see on the spindle there's a little notch right here. And this washer matches up with that notch right there. Then what you need to do is you need to make sure that the pin that's on the inner lock nut lines up with one of the holes on the washer. So I'm going to rotate this inner lock nut just a touch until the pin matches up with one of the holes on the washer. And there, that's what it looks like when it's flush. Next, we're going to take the outer lock nut and we're going to screw that on there and tighten it down with one of these. It's a Performance Tool 4-pin 2.375 spindle nut. So this socket just fits over the lock nut like this. And you can use this to torque it down to 150 foot-pounds. Now, the previous owner of my truck probably didn't have one of these things, and that's why this was really, really loose. Some people will try to lock it down. You can actually see there's some dents on it from where someone hit it with a screwdriver to try to lock it in. Don't be ghetto. Make sure to buy one of those sockets because there's no real way to get the lock nut tightened to 150 foot-pounds using a screwdriver. And if the lock nut's not on there tight, it's gonna back off and it could potentially ruin the bearings like it did mine, or the wheel might fall off and that won't be fun. As far as the thrust washers go, you have two options. The older trucks came with a single thrust washer. The newer trucks come with 3 pieces. I think, and if I'm wrong, please correct me in the comments, but I think the metal piece goes in first, then the spline washer, and then the plastic washer. I'm not really sure why Ford changed the design on these, but I decided to use the older style washer, the thicker version of this, the one piece on my truck, just to see what it will do. And then I kept these in reserve, and I also have 2 more brand new sets. After getting the rotor and axle situated, we can move on to the caliper and brake pads. Now this part I forgot to film, so I'm probably gonna shoot another video of this the next time I do a brake job. Once the pads are seated on the caliper, you can bolt the caliper onto the knuckle. Remove the brake line from the old caliper. Put a new crush washer on both sides of the bolt. And then torque it down to the new caliper. Once everything is bolted up, we need to bleed the brakes. Start by opening the brake fluid reservoir. While you're bleeding the brakes, you don't want the reservoir to go dry, so make sure you're checking on it as you go and fill it up so that you don't get bubbles into the system. Position your brake bleeder wrench over the bleeder valve and then attach the bleeder hose. These one-man bleeder bottles can be pretty handy. Once you're ready to go, open the bleeder valve, go inside the truck and give the brake pedal a couple pumps. Check the fluid reservoir and make sure it's topped off. Continue the process until there are no more bubbles in the hose. Close the bleeder valve and then remove the hose. Top off the reservoir one more time and then replace the cap. And that's pretty much it. I hope you guys found this video useful. If you did, please like, comment, subscribe, all the things, and we'll see you in the next video.